hard to follow up after the Christ tandem, isn't it? Hey, they were on fire today, and of course Sienna, much cuter than me. So there you go. That's what you're left with. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark, and I'm privileged to be able to share with you this morning. Now, I've got a question with you to start. Who are you? Now, don't answer that to me out loud because I'm not sure I'll catch them all. But who are you? Who do you think you are? When you meet someone new and they say, "Tell me about yourself," what do you say? If you're like most of us, that's an uncomfortable question for you. Unless maybe you're an extrovert, and then you know it's hard for you to stop telling them who you are. But for most of us, you know that is quite an uncomfortable question. Who are you? And I just want you, as we talk today, to keep asking yourself that question, because it's actually a very, very important question, and it's something we're going to talk about this week, and then in a couple of weeks' time I'm going to come back and I'm going to do another one. Because the answer isn't always clear. One of the things we tend to do when people ask that question is we think, right, what is it I know about myself that I can say? And we might start with roles. And what we do is we give ourselves these labels. We say, right, I'm a Christian maybe. I was speaking up the front at church, so I thought maybe I should start with that one, right? I'm a follower of Jesus, right? That's my label. And so maybe you would say, you would explain that to someone. Well, I attend church, or I follow Jesus, or I'm religious, whatever it is you say. Now, one of my great privileges, of course, is to be a husband. Right? So I'm married to Noelle, so I win. Sorry, everyone else, but it's true. So I'm a husband, right? And that's a real privilege for me. And so often when I'm introducing myself to people, I usually talk about Noelle, mainly because she's more interesting than me. And so that's the way I introduce. Now, I also have the privilege of being a dad. I love being a dad. Being a dad's good fun. Sometimes it's hard work, but I'm a dad to two 17-year-olds and a 19-year-old, and they are just really fine young men. I'm really proud of who they are, and we have a great relationship, and there's a fairly steady amount of trash talk in our house, and they don't mind trash talking their dad, and I like it. So I'm quite proud of them, and so I like to tell people about my kids, and I tend to boast about them. Now, I'm also an engineer, all right? So I'm quite proud of this too. Most of you switched off then. You thought, oh, great. He's one of those. Yes, I am. And I'm proud of it. So I'm an engineer. That's what I do for a job. I build warships, which is slightly cooler than just calling myself an engineer. But that's what I do, and so that's part of who I am. So often I will say to people, that's a role I play. Now, we don't always go with roles. Sometimes we go with things that we think describe us. Now, I've got one here that says nerd. You might think they're the same thing, and I guess they kind of are. I just wanted to say it twice. But I'll tell you a funny story about nerd. This morning I woke up and I'd been syncing my message between two different computers. And who knows, that's a great idea. It's a great idea until the old message overwrites the new message. So I woke up this morning with about a third of my message gone. And we were driving to church and I was talking to Caleb's friend Ness, and Ness said, "Oh, which part of the third did you lose?" I said, "Well, I tell you what, whichever third of the message you don't like, that was the part. That was the part." Okay, so I'll give you that tip as well. If you don't like it, if you don't like more than a third, then that's all my bad. All right. One of the things that's true of me, and we don't always have positive labels, right? One of the things that's true of me is I can be quite insecure. Right, that's a label. That's a truth about me, and so I don't always feel comfortable in my own skin. And I suspect there are many of you out there that's true of, where you'd say, if I'm really honest, if I thought about a negative label for myself, maybe it would be insecure. Now, despite the fact that I am in fact an introvert, I can be quite loud. quite proudly at a university. At a university camp, I won the Foghorn Award because I can be pretty loud, and that is particularly useful when one is trying to get the attention of a group, right? People will come to you, tap you on your shoulder, can you do your thing? And usually I can, because there's rarely anyone that can speak louder than me. The flip side of that is when I whisper, it sounds like normal people talking. So that doesn't work out so well when I want to be keeping something a secret, right? Not that I ever want to keep secrets, but yeah, so loud. My boys like to tell me I'm old, right? Now, that's okay, right? No, generally speaking, it pops out, Dad, you're so old, when I don't understand a meme they're explaining to me. I'm still only vaguely aware of what a meme is, but apparently they're all hilarious. My wife finds them hilarious, and I don't get it. So that might be about my sense of humour rather than me being old. The other thing that proves to my kids that I'm old is that I don't understand why they have to respond to a message on their phone within 30 milliseconds of it coming in. That doesn't make sense to me, but apparently that's because I'm old. So anyway, that's fine. So we use these labels, right? And you could look at that, and I'm going to leave that up there because it's going to take longer to pull it all off again. But you can look at that and say, there you go, that's Mark. But I think we know that that's not the case, right? Our labels, whatever labels we put on ourselves or what labels other people put on us, aren't necessarily who we are. You see, our identity, who we are, the answer to that question, who are you? Our identity is our definition of ourselves. It's our definition of ourselves. And you might say to yourself, why do we even care? What about I just get on with life and do my thing? Why do I even care how I define myself? Well, it's quite interesting because actually people care a lot, and you just may not notice it. Even this week, it showed up in political circles. The Prime Minister was talking about this idea of identity politics, which is an interesting idea. And identity politics, at its heart, is this idea that there's a group of people with common values that have historically been oppressed, and then they gather together, right? Classic example of that was from 2020, Black Lives Matter. Remember that movement, Black Lives Matter, was very much a part of identity politics. And so what you start to see is actually people care very much about who they are. They really do care. And if you try to tell them it doesn't matter, just go along and float through life, people will resist that. Now, they might act like they don't care, but try pushing back against some element that's part of their identity, We've got Mother's Day coming up next week, and I love Mother's Day. I won't be here, unfortunately, but nonetheless, I love it. But we have Mother's Day coming up, and I find, and I've never seen anything more terrifying, right, than a mum who someone upsets their kid, right? The most terrifying people in the world are mums when someone has to go at their kids, right? Because and as mums, maybe they don't think of themselves, I don't define myself as a mother or think in that way, but the minute anyone attacks their kids, they get really upset, right? That's good, that's healthy. That's a healthy thing, but you'll find that in your own life, you have a bunch of things that you are passionate about, that are true of you, that you see as true of you, that if anyone messes with that, then you'll react. Actually, our identity defines not only who we are, but it also drives our behaviours, our thoughts, and our feelings, which is really, really interesting, right? So you might think that you are just freely thinking about stuff or feeling certain things, but if you were to look inside at the moment, what you were feeling, what you were thinking, what you will find often is that it came out of your internal identity, how you see yourself. There was a study done around runners, and it's quite interesting that people who call themselves runners, as opposed to people who run, are much more consistent in running. Isn't that interesting, right? So the idea being that the minute you identify yourself, you say to yourself, I am a runner, You are much more likely to train. You are much more likely to eat healthy. You are much more likely to get to bed on time so you can get up and do running. And this has been proven again and again. Similar thing with people who vote versus voters. Right now in Australia, of course, we have to vote. But over, say, in the United States, they actually did studies and they found that people who define themselves as voters were much more consistent in voting than people who just said, yeah, we vote, right? Because identity drives behavior. And so it's so critical for us to really get to the heart of who we are, right? And it's not just this. It's not just this. But I want to start this morning with who God says we are, because that's always a good place to start. And I want to look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 to 10. And I think it's going to come up on the screen. Oh, there it is. Fantastic. I love our team. They just crack on. So 1 Peter 2, 4 to 10. And it says this: "You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for a great honor. You are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. What's more, you are his holy priests. Through the mediation of Jesus Christ, you offer spiritual sacrifices that please God. As the scriptures say, I am placing a cornerstone in Jerusalem, chosen for great honor, and anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Yes, you trust him. Yes, you who trust him recognize the honor God has given him. But for those who reject him, the stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. And he is the stone that makes people stumble and the rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they do not obey God's word, and so they meet the fate that has been planned for them. But you are not like that. You are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God. For he has called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you had no identity as a people, now you are God's people. Once you received no mercy, but now you've received God's mercy." And so I want to look at some of the things that are consistent and actually in identity, and actually they're consistent with the way the world defines identity too. It's quite interesting. It's almost like God knows what he's talking about. But I want to start with this idea of becoming, because that's the title of this little series I'm doing. And the thing is, what we get stuck with is actually over time our identity develops, right? And so who we were 10 years ago is not necessarily who we are now. Is that true? Have people experienced that in their lives? And what we try to do often is we go one or two ways, right? We either try to defend, no, this is who I am, right? So for instance, for me, I'm an introvert. So that means I should not be at large gatherings, right? Now, there was a time in my life where that was true. That was my choice, right? I would choose to spend time in my room rather than hang out with people. It's not who I am now. Now, am I still an introvert? Yes. But I choose to redefine that idea of introversion as not necessitating that I'm by myself all the time, right? I choose to push back against that. And so I love the way Peter says it here. He says, you are coming to Christ. And the actual phrasing of it in the Greek is actually that you continue to come to Christ. You continue to come to him. In fact, what you are doing is you are continually coming to him and saying, who am I, God? Who am I, God? Who am I, God? And you're inviting him to tell you. And as you do that, he's growing you. And he's changing you. And he's making you more of who he wants you to be. Now, I'm convinced God has a snapshot of who he's turning you into, right? Of who you are becoming. But you know what? And he's very wise in this. He doesn't tell you what that snapshot is. Because right now you might look at that snapshot and say, oh, I don't want to do that. Right? I don't want to be that. Right? And so it's pretty easy for us to understand why God wouldn't necessarily show us where we're going. But he will show you the next step, and he will show you as you come to him how he's developing you. The other thing I like here that's pretty critical before we get into some of these pillars maybe of identity is this idea that anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. And what is Peter saying there? He's saying, look, And Peter would have been relatively old when he wrote this for the time. And he's saying, look, I've seen it. I've seen God move in people's lives. I've seen him tell them who they are, and I've seen them believe him, and I've seen the results. And the results are always good. Now, there might be times in your life where God is working in your life and it doesn't feel good at the time, right? That's absolutely true. You know, I know there are times when God is dealing with me on some area of my life that's a bit broken and needs fixing. And God says, now's the time to fix it. And usually I say, no, it's not. And God always wins. But it doesn't always feel good. But what Peter's saying is actually the end result of getting your identity from God is the best answer. You will never be embarrassed to do that. Now, like I said, three pillars of identity. They're the same three pillars that come up again and again in a lot of the psychological and secular stuff as well, right? The first one is alignment. This idea of alignment. We read here, Jesus is the living cornerstone of God's temple. Now, what on earth does that mean? Right? Now, if you're a builder here, maybe you're all over that, but most of us are not builders. And so a cornerstone was a stone, surprisingly, was a stone that was set first for a building, right? So if you were gonna knock up your new house or your temple or some other building back in Jesus' day, you would put down a stone, and it would be a very accurate stone. So it would be cut very accurately, so all the angles would be right, and you'd put that down. And what you would say then is, right, I'm going to build the rest of my building based on that stone, right? So you put it down, you set it down, and you line up the rest of your bricks or stones, and probably back then, you line them up against that, right? So you don't have to line them up against each other because you're lining them all up against this one stone, this cornerstone. So when Peter says that Jesus is our cornerstone, what he's saying is that Jesus is the one that we line up on. That we line up on him. Now, what Peter doesn't say, because this is what we expect him to say, is that what Jesus teaches, what Jesus says, the example Jesus lived, that's our cornerstone, right? That's our thing that we line up with. But he doesn't say that at all, right? What he says is, no, Jesus is your cornerstone. Now, what does that mean? Because we interpret that, that must mean I just got to follow Jesus' teaching. But that's not what Peter's saying. Peter's saying, actually, if you want to get lined up with who God says you are, you need to be in relationship with Jesus. That's what you really need, right? You don't need to go away, punch your way through the Bible once and go, right, got everything I need to do. Get your little What Would Jesus Do band that they used to be really popular back when I was a young person, which was, as my boys would tell you, millions of years ago. But that's what we buy into. Or I'm going to listen to the best preachers in the world and they're going to tell me what I need to be doing, right? And who I am. They're going to tell me. But Peter says, no. Jesus is your cornerstone. And the invitation then is to interact with him regularly, routinely, to interact with him, to talk with him, to listen to what he has to say. Now you might say, that's a strange thing, to be aligned to a person rather than a set of values, right? Rather than a philosophy or a set of rules maybe. But it's quite interesting that we do it all the time. Don't we? You think back to your school days and you think there was probably someone in your friendship group who was a bit of a leader. And you'd line yourself up with them, right? They'd be the one that you followed. They'd be the one that you kind of replicated the things they did because they were the leader in the group, right? Husbands and wives, this happens often in relationships, right? There's often one member of the couple that's a bit stronger and a bit more directive than the other, and the other tends to line themselves up. It happens often. In all sorts of relationships, this happens. But the problem is, anyone else that you could line yourself up with, you're setting yourself up because they're like a wonky cornerstone, right? Fair? right? As good as the person you choose to follow is, they're not lined up straight, right? And to be fair, I think if you ask them whether they should be the cornerstone of your life, they'd probably say no. That's a terrible idea. But the opposite is that Jesus says, no, I am your cornerstone. I am the one you can line yourself up with. Now, it's quite interesting that people look at that and they go, oh, if I do that, if I line myself up with Jesus, there's some limitations to that, right? I'm going to lose some freedoms here. I'm going to have to give stuff up. And I've got great news for you. You're absolutely right. It's good to be right. You're right. You will. And what I want to tell you is every time that you align yourself with something, whether it's Jesus, whether it's a philosophy or a set of values, every time you line yourself up with something, you choose to say yes to certain things and you choose to say no to other things. Every time. There is no alignment that you can do that doesn't cause you to have to say no to some things as well as yes to things. Does that make sense? So let me give you an example. Earlier this year, I was having some relatively annoying muscle pains, right? And I went to the doctors and they had no idea, but they gave me some advice. And one of the things they said, which proved to be quite useful, was talking about inflammatory foods and being careful what you eat, right? Now, in my ideal world, I can eat whatever the heck I want and not have muscle pain, right? So that's the way we want to roll, right? We want to eat whatever we want and not have muscle pain. But that option wasn't available to me at the start of this year, right? I got to choose one or the other. Which do you want, Mark? And to me, it was a relatively easy choice. I just got used to muscle pain. No, no, I didn't really. I just started to give some foods up, because those foods were causing me pain. And I was more concerned about feeling healthy and whole than I was about having exactly the things I wanted, right? And that's the invitation Jesus gives to you. Align yourself with me, and yes, you will give some things up. But what I promise you is the health you'll feel in that will be worth it. I love what he says, Peter says here, through the mediation of Jesus Christ, you offer spiritual sacrifices that please God. You see, what God is not doing here is inviting you to just give everything up. Great, I come to Jesus, I've just got to give everything up. That's my identity now, I've got nothing. But that's not actually what he's saying. What he's saying is, actually, there's certain things in your life that you need to give up. And I'll tell you what those things are. Right? And I find that really encouraging. God doesn't just leave us hanging, but he wants to work with us to grow us into the identity he has for us. He wants to build us up. And every now and again, he's going to put his finger on something and say, you know what? That's not helping you. That's causing you some level of unhealth. That is damaging your life. I want to deal with that now. And the danger, right, what we do as Christians is we think we can work all this out. Oh, I know what God's going to say next, so I'm just going to go after that. And I'm often surprised about what God puts his finger on. It's often different than what I expect. Now, the second pillar here is purpose, right? It says, you are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple, right? That's what Peter says. And you might say to yourself, right, okay, so there's this building metaphor and God's building something, and I'm part of the thing that he's building, right? Great, that sounds great. And when we talk about purpose, and purpose is quite a popular topic of conversation these days in the world, right? Sales of Man's Search for Meaning, for instance, is a great book. Are just going off through the roof because people are desperate to know, what am I doing here? What am I doing here in this world, And probably part of it is the chaos we've had over the last couple of years has probably contributed to that. What am I doing here? What does it really mean to live life? And then Peter tells us, well, God's building you into a temple, right? And you think, oh, that's interesting, but what does that mean? What it means is God is taking individuals and he's building them into something that allows him to show the world who he is. Right? Now, often when we talk about purpose, we often ask ourselves the question, well, what am I doing? What am I doing, right? And often when you talk to people about what is your purpose or what is your calling, they will tell you, well, I'm gonna do all this great stuff. Usually the young people tell you that, right? Because they haven't been crushed by the world yet, right? So they say, I'm going to do all this great stuff. And then you talk to people my age and they say, yeah, I just got to get through the day, right? And it's just sort of this downdrift. And then the good news is it picks up again, right? Because then they retire and they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go places and do stuff again. There's a bit of this kind of curve going on here, right? And we think very much in individual terms, right? We think about, what is God going to do in my life? What am I going to do for God? But the invitation actually from God is not that. He says, what part are you going to play in my mission? What part are you going to play? And it's so critical for us to get that, because we think if there's not some big calling that we think we're particularly invited into, that maybe our life isn't worth anything, that maybe we don't have purpose. But I want to tell you that if you get to be a brick in the temple of God, that he shows the world who he is, then that is the most valuable thing that you can do. And I want to tell you that this being a brick can be all sorts of things. If you really believe that the brick that God makes you is worth it, if you really believe that, then you're going to expect amazing things. In fact, what we see actually throughout history is people that were quite ordinary have ended up doing amazing things. I don't know if you know the story of William Wilberforce, but he was a relatively well-off British man at the time where there was still slavery in Britain. And if you read his story, it's quite fascinating because, the picture, if you don't really know a lot about him, the picture you got is, William Wilberforce, he went there and he crushed slavery in England, right? Because that's what happened, right? He actually started a movement that ended up defeating slavery in England, which was just fantastic, right? But if you read the story of William Wilberforce, he was quite reactive and he was quite reluctant to actually get involved, right? It's like, oh, okay. And so he'd do something. And he had people around him all the time pumping him up. Come on, William, get into it. Because he was reluctant, right? And I think sometimes we feel like unless we're bouncing off the walls and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, then maybe God's not working, right? But actually, God will use us if we keep offering ourselves up. He doesn't need us to make things happen. But he can do amazing things if we let him through our lives. And what I want to tell you is that God has, I think he has big purposes for you, but I think he also has a lot of little purposes for you. And so when you show up to university or to work or get up tomorrow morning and start the housework or whatever it is you do with your life, what I want to tell you is God has a purpose for you in that. He has a purpose for you in that. So don't be worried about the big P purpose so much. I think that's what we do. We worry about the big P purpose. What's the calling of my life? But God's inviting you to live with purpose in every area of your life. There's a great Hillsong Young and Free song at the moment called All My Best Friends. And the line in that I just love, and I was listening to it again this morning while I was panicking about the loss of my message, was, all my best friends are sick of pretending. Wow. All of my best friends are sick of pretending. The invitation God gives us is to show others his goodness. That's what Peter tells us, to show others his goodness. And I think what this world desperately needs now is people who are animated about showing people his goodness. And it doesn't have to be on a stage. It doesn't have to be in a boardroom. It doesn't have to be on a YouTube channel. But what it has to be is consistent and real. Because this world desperately, desperately wants something real right now. And that is the purpose we're called to. to be real. And finally, I want to talk about community. What I love about this is very much identity becomes this thing where we convince ourselves that identity is how shall I put it, an individual thing. I am who I am, right? This is who I am. But actually, the reality is, most of our identity comes from others. Most of it, right? Reflecting back off of others, interacting with others. We work out who we are through that process. You know, Peter says here, you are a chosen people, you are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. And when we read that, we read you as in you individuals, right? So Peter's talking to a church, and they're reading it and they're thinking, we're all individuals, right? But then he says something really interesting. He says, once you had no identity as a people, now you are God's people. And here's what Peter's saying here, which is really, really interesting, is that we are not just islands. We are not just individuals. In fact, the reality is the world knows this, right? One of the reasons why this whole conversation around identity politics exists is because people have realized, I'm not an island. I've got to get together with like-minded people. I've got to get together with people who talk my language, who understand me, and I've got to reflect backwards and forwards with them, right? Community is a critical element of your identity. The level to which you are real with your community is the level that you will become comfortable in your own skin. How often have we suffered from imposter syndrome? People know that word, that feeling that we present to the world an image that we feel, rightly or wrongly, that we feel is different than our own. Now, I've been an engineer for over 20 years. I still feel that as an engineer. You know, some of you are thinking to yourself, just Mark, get over it. Come on, get over it. But the reality is, I suspect for most of us in this place, there are areas of our life that we feel like imposters, right? Where we feel like maybe what we present is different than who we are. And what Peter does by saying you have an identity, what he's inviting us to do is to say, don't worry so much about your flaws, your individual flaws. Don't worry so much about protecting that image you've got. He's saying, no. Your community has an identity. So for us, that means Rise has an identity, right? Rise has an identity, and we get to be part of that. You know, City Lights Church that we just talked about this morning, they have an identity. Bless them. We're excited for them. They got some great people coming their way. You know, they have an identity. The church has an identity. And the point to which we understand that it's not just about us is the point to which we can start to become comfortable in our own skin, right? Because if someone else can be strong in an area, maybe I don't have to, as part of my identity, be strong in that area. Maybe at a time like that, I can lean on that person. And then there are times, right, when I can be strong. There are certain areas where I can be strong and that person can lean on me. And so what God invites us to do is to not have to be able to do it all, which, by the way, is the great lie of the modern era, that you can do it all. All you need is Google and a credit card and you can solve every problem. It's the great lie of our modern age. We need each other. God knew that. God knows that, but he knew it back 2,000 years ago when he was telling Peter what to write. He knew back then that we would need to know today that we need each other. What I want to invite you to do now is to stand, if you don't mind, please, if you're able.